So, Cyberpunk is getting closer, and we have a glut of new information from an interesting source, a Polish CD Projekt Red community event. And this is something that's indicative of a broader trend that is the real topic of this video, the increase in direct-to-consumer marketing and how that is going to change the games industry. So on the Cyberpunk topic, well, they run one of these events every year for the company, right? They get local community members out, they've got some free, themed food and drinks, and they basically hang out. Now, at this Cyberpunk-themed event, they held a Q&A, and they were openly answering questions about the game directly to their community. Now, the only record we have of this is, it's an attendee's recollection posted to the Cyberpunk subreddit. So, not a perfect source, but to summarize here super quickly, the game is promising CD Projekt Red have basically been quite unreluctant to compromise on their vision. On the topic of game length, the main story is shorter than The Witcher 3, but it will have more replayability. In addition to that, their side quests extend into further branching quests that may impact the rest of the game. They were also asked about the post-game, and apparently, this is kind of interesting, they have found a, quote, really cool way to allow people to continue playing after the ending. So, no idea what that means, but it's certainly intriguing. Access locations will change based on your choices, as will the appearance of V's apartment. They also say that there are going to be differences between the difficulty levels, but given the scope of the game, it might be really hard to do anything beyond just enemy strength. And they also mention how they're handling the sex scenes. Now, despite being in first person, these are going to be, enough to, quote, satisfy everyone, and they are all mocapped. Now, that being mocapped was quite interesting. That actually, it did lead to quite a wave of articles from, I'd say, a lot of the usual suspects who will try to be outraged at that sort of thing. What I will say from having a knowledge of, video games animation is that hand animating a scene like that, it's going to take a whole bunch of time. But if you can just get people in, those mocap penguin suits, have them flop about for a little bit, that's going to save your animators a lot of time. So that being mocapped, I think that's a funny tidbit that, that actually happened. But in terms of the production pipeline, it actually does make sense, and there really isn't anything to be outraged about there. Now, they did reportedly answer a whole bunch more on specifics, gameplay stuff, and many of it just boiled down to, things being harder than they expected to do, but they didn't want to compromise, and they found a solution. Now, that's only a small selection. If you're interested in hearing more, then a link to the rest of it will be down in this video's description. But for me here, what's really important is talking about what this actually means. Now, I'm going to share thoughts about the game itself in a bit, but I think for me, the most important thing here is the direct-to-consumer communication. This really matters for all of us. The sheer amount of detail here would have made for some great interview content for a publication, but instead, their team members had a few drinks with the community, and they just talked about it. They went to their most devoted fans. Now, much like, say, Path of Exile or Warframe's conventions or maybe CitizenCon, CD Projekt Red have focused efforts on having fun, engaged fans in a way that benefits both parties. And this largely cuts out the potential for mistranslations or, a lack of context that occasionally comes from games outlets, like, say, with the recent multiplayer microtransaction affair. A little bit of, clarification of that earlier in this week. A translation of their investor call was circulated that suggested that microtransactions were actually involved in the future multiplayer offering for Cyberpunk, but actually all that was really said is that they've got nothing to share on that, but that they want their monetization to be fair and actually provide value for the money. Anyway, getting back to going direct to consumer, this general approach can allow for players to engage even further with their favorite games, which from a business perspective makes a lot of sense. And when I say engage here, I don't mean spend money, I mean just feeling involved in that process. Now, CD Projekt Red are not the only ones who are doing this, right? You've got ExileCon, you've got TennoCon, you've got CitizenCon. They're all fantastic examples there. TennoCon and ExileCon, they really work for fostering the identity of players for those franchises, right? They even go as far as to typically save the biggest news for their own conventions, like Path of Exile 2. That was announced at the recent ExileCon, and TennoCon usually has an expansion or a feature announcement, and I think this is also part of what people loved about old Blizzard. Like the Warframe team, they even said that TennoCon for them is the only hard deadline they have for the development team because it's about them connecting with their fans, and that's their big priority. So what I really want to talk about here is the fostering of culture and communities and what going direct to consumer means, and really how a lot of this, it's fostered by social media, it's fostered by how the internet's actually developed. So way back, right, it used to be that if you needed to get information out, you kind of needed to get in there with the old guard. What I mean there is you need to, say, get with a magazine. And those magazines went digital, and, well, the same thing would happen. You would have your game announcements all being filtered through this journalistic lens. Now, normally, when that's all working really well, what happens is that journalistic lens is filtering out BS, right? It's traditionally what it's supposed to be about, protecting consumers from, corporations doing bad stuff. However, I think it's pretty obvious that's what has happened is over time, along with the rest of digital media, doing business has become harder. Ad rates have fallen, ad blocking has increased, and this has led to a lot of debate, a lot of the weird fluff articles that you see, and especially a lot of the outrage bait at a lot of these, outlets. And that really, I think, is beginning to pose a little bit of a problem for game developers. I think that's why you're seeing this move of just going direct to customer, because we're now in a situation where a lot of these companies have built up their brand, they build up their social media presence, they even now can have physical events, to the point where they actually don't need the traditional sort of games journalism stuff. Now, what's very interesting there is you're kind of seeing a bit of a shift in that games journalism away from actually breaking news and really just reposting press releases, and that's actually moving towards the sort of weird commentary, op-ed sort of slant that you're actually getting now, which of course, has its pros and its cons, and that's not to say that there's not lots of real journalism going on out there. I mean, there is quite a lot of that. Look at the Echo Fox situation. I think that's a pretty major example of really good journalism being done. But this whole shift of going direct to the customer is so very interesting. And for me, it's really all about how these companies foster a meta culture around their game, and how they basically don't want to just, be a game developer who gets some money, makes a game, releases the game, sells the game. It's all got to be a part, ideally, of a larger cultural experience that their community can have. So it's a bit like how they've, they say released Witcher 3, that made fans of CD Projekt Red. Those people are now going to be really into Cyberpunk, and that's all going to be a sort of a self-fulfilling thing, a self-sustaining thing. If you want another example of that I think is actually quite well done, but is at a really big and depersonalized scale, I would actually say League of Legends. And this is really me getting at the sort of meta community, meta experience sort of perspective, right? The amount of money that they put into their esports event as a lost leader to create a large community event, and say doing things like the KDA music video, the most recent True Damage music video, tying that into the skin releases, all of that stuff is creating a meta experience around League of Legends that allows that community to kind of be, to foster itself in its own spaces, but also in ones that are owned by the developer. And in a way, it does not at all rely on the traditional media, the traditional media engine, I suppose, to actually get it to happen. And that's why you're seeing things like ExileCon, CitizenCon for Star Citizen, and in this case, CD Projekt Red, just doing really well, having that event with their really engaged community. And in a way, there are business elements to this that do make sense. If you're going to double down on anyone, you're probably going to want to double down on your most dedicated fans, because they are the people who have probably going to, pre-order the most expensive edition of your game. If, say, you're, Cyberpunk, right? That's something that's definitely happened. If there's games like, say, Star Citizen, I mean, you want CitizenCon to be an incredible experience, because you know that some of the people at that, they're probably going to spend a ludicrous amount of money on virtual spaceships. Same thing goes for League of Legends, creating that really strong cultural experience, because people are going to get that 10,500 Riot Point True Damage complete pack so they can get all the skins and the stuff. So when I sit here talking about the rise of direct-to-consumer marketing and the fostering of a self-sustaining community and that sort of closer connection with the developers, I'm not doing that purely in a we're going to own the traditional games media sense, because there is a very clear business element to that that's going to be really important. I'm more just saying that it's interesting how the traditional media thing is kind of becoming less and less relevant. Oh yeah, and just to quickly do thoughts on Cyberpunk, I mean, it's kind of interesting for me. To me, it does look like generic Cyberpunk, which does make sense because it's almost coming directly from the source of Cyberpunk, right, in a way. So that's something that for me counts a little bit against it, where it's I've seen a lot of those aesthetics before. However, from playing Witcher 3, especially things like the Bloody Baron, I am expecting that they're going to be able to do a generic enough setting, but that within that, the actual characters, plot lines, the way that your choices matter, I think they'll actually do a very good job of that. And for me, that's the main reason why I'm interested in that game. I think mechanically it looks interesting and all of that, but for me, it's if this is going to be very plain Cyberpunk, at least in its initial visuals, if this is going to be the most high depth, high quality exploration of that in gaming, then yeah, I'm totally into it, and I'll probably set aside like 2 weekends to just disappear and play the game. Definitely one of the things I'm the most excited for in 2020. Take like the Cyberpunk information, right? Especially the mocapping of those scenes. That's something that if you communicate that directly to your community, they're going to be like, oh, well, that's just a funny tale of development of how they solved this problem, got around the animation time that would be needed making that scene, fully from scratch. But of course, is that going to be taken in the best faith by a lot of the games media? No. I think another good example of that is the trans model in the advertising in Cyberpunk 2077, like the in-game advertising, which from the developer's perspective, when they were communicating with their fans, the dev was saying, oh yeah, this is like about the exploitation of beauty, and it's very much within the cyberpunk genre and the criticism of corporations. So that's what the developer actually intended there. And of course, their fans, because they like them, they assume that they have good intentions when it comes to the art that they're creating, are going to take that in a pretty honest way, in a good faith manner. Then what happens? Well, it gets on to the Polygons and the Kotakus, and they make big outrage articles about it. And I think that's another one of those reasons why direct-to-consumer really is going to be rising. Now, that said, there is another angle to this. Traditionally, whenever journalism is doing well, it is a little bit of a filter, and one of the reasons why journalists, I think, more so in the past than now, because digital media has really made things very messy indeed, but one of the reasons why that was a very respected role is because trust would be placed in the journalists to actually categorize information, to do the background reading, and to actually work out what stuff here is good, what stuff is bad. If that's happening less via going direct to consumer a lot more, that does actually foster the ability for exploitative creation of superfans. And that can be a problem. I mean, if you want an example of this, like there are Stadia superfans who, have disregarded the articles, disregarded a lot of the opinion pieces, and just absolutely love Stadia. Now, for Google, they're the people they'll want to double down on, even though many of us who I think have a more critical view of Stadia would think, well, is that a bit exploitative? Is Stadia actually a really bad product? So there are situations like that. So Blizzard Entertainment are a really good example here. I think because they used to have that really strong community feel, but they've really let that go in more recent times. But of course, my other channel is focused on World of Warcraft, so it's an area where I've got a lot of experience. Now, there are a lot of times where Blizzard will do things that, really don't feel that great. But they've been able to foster such a super fan community through things like BlizzCon and how they generally have handled some things that they can just get away with a lot of crazy stuff that mean that World of Warcraft, even if it has half the subscribers it used to have, is making more money than ever because they've been able to double down on those super fans. So there really is a push and a pull here. I think for engaged community members being closer to the developers, having a more honest thing there, that is a better experience for them. And I think it's also indicative of how really a lot of journalism is no longer performing its function. Journalism, I think, is moving a little bit more into just content, right? It's creating outrage, and that's not really ideal. I think that's pissing off a lot of game devs. But what's kind of happened there is that journalistic filter, the actual purpose there of, holding corporations accountable for their BS, sometimes that is happening, sometimes it's not happening. But the more that companies are able to create the superfans, create the sort of meta community around their game, then the less that stuff is relevant. And the more that those companies can actually exploit, I think, both the consumers, but also like their actual employees. So it's a very interesting push and pull. Definitely if I'm thinking about the studio that we're doing here, the community is where we're going to go first. That's going to be the entire point of what we're doing. They are our true audience. So, it's interesting. I've said a lot of pros here, a lot of cons, a lot of critical and suspicious things as well. Yeah, if I look at our situation, why would I go to Kotaku and Polygon wanting them to do an article about the game that we're going to have out in 2020 when I could just do a far more natural thing with you guys directly to the camera? And I think that's something that a lot of larger companies are beginning to think as well. And that's why you see your TennoCon, your ExileCon, your CitizenCon, and that's why you also see that those are three games that I think you could almost say on a per capita basis are extremely highly monetized. And a lot of that is because of that really strong direct connection to the fans. So I would love to know, What are your opinions on this? Where do you think that line is? Would you actually rather have a little bit less of a connection, but a far stronger journalistic filter to hold things to account? Or do you think that it's far better to be super direct to consumer, but for the consumers to be educated enough to really be able to, be, I guess, skeptical and very critical of that relationship if it potentially goes wrong? I would love to know, because I think this is something that is going to define many of the relations within gaming as we move forward over the next decade. So let me know. Thank you very much for watching this video, and with that, I'll see you next time.